Carson, Leno, Fallon. Now, it's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in the studio today, about to have a conversation way out in Missouri with Jerry Eisterhold. Introductions in just a moment. Wine Talks, of course, available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for your podcasting. Hey, have a listen to Jeff and Kathy from Uncorked in Hermosa Beach. I got a chance to go visit my old stomping grounds, sit with them in this retail environment, and talk about all things wine, but what's happening out in the industry, what people are looking for, certainly what's going on in the coastal cities of California when it comes to wine consumption. Really fascinating conversation coming from my old hometown, but not why we're here today. Here to have a conversation with Jerry Eisterhold of the TerraVox Winery. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You know, there's an interesting article, and I think it was the Smithsonian. Was it in the Smithsonian magazine?
Yeah, Smithsonian magazine
about what you're doing out there in Missouri, and it piqued my interest, and that's why I wanted you on the show, and I appreciate you coming on. But are there indigenous wine grapes in the world of the United States of America?
Yeah. They're right outside. They're right outside the window here.
So, but tell me about that. I mean, there was. I'm sure you're versed in the pre-prohibition proliferation of wine coming from Missouri, Ohio, Kentucky, Louisiana. All of them were making wines, and then post-prohibition, that it was rather different. But what are these grapes? What are we doing with them? And what makes them so interesting to you?
Well, let's see where to begin. So I guess starting with the kind of a happenstance discovery of a book that was written by this guy, Thomas Volney Munson, that had put together the USDA exhibition on grapes for the Columbia Exposition back in 1893.
1893.
And out of that, he had published this thing about the hundreds of cultivars that he had been developing out of, I'll say about half a dozen of the 31 genuses of grapes that he had identified on the planet. And one genus is vinifera, which is where most of the stuff you're familiar with comes from. Another is Labrusca, where you get Concord and Welch's grape juice, and then that stuff with the sort of foxy flavor. But there were all these others, of which I think 27 of them will grow in the Midwest because we have more genetic diversity here than any other place in the country, because we have all these overlapping ecosystems. And a lot of people were working with, not every one of these will make a great wine or even wine at all, but a bunch of them do. And people were working with this, and all that work was kind of blown out of the water with prohibition.
So let's stall right there for a second, just so I can understand for the listeners. When we talk about wine grapes like Cabernet Merlot and the noble grapes in the genus line, that's Vitis vinifera. The exact Latin translation I don't know, but those are the top level grapes from winemaking. Let's just call it that. The next level down, is that Lambrusca?
It's one of all of the others, but it's the one that has taken a foothold because of Concord and Welch's grape juice and all of that.
Is that then the category, the classification of the grapes that you're growing now for the things you're doing at TerraVox?
No, actually, we're trying to avoid Labrusca because it has the reputation and, frankly, the taste of of something that you don't really want to put in your mouth with food. So,
grape jelly.
but it kind of is a half curiosity and half missionary impulse, just to try to get people to appreciate that there's something valuable that comes from this place. And if I were born in Connecticut, I'd be doing something like that in Connecticut. But here I am in Missouri, and this is one of the things that I found here, and we're trying to see what we can do to bring that from being an agricultural something to something that is everything that wine can be, which is, sometimes pretty damn good and even sometimes kind of transcendent.
It's such a fascinating approach to the wine industry because everybody knows, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of winemakers across the world. There's thousands in California alone that would look at a Pinot Noir or a Cabernet and say, "Oh yeah, we know what kind of yeast is going to work with this. We know what kind of acid this is going to produce. We have a phenolic ripeness character that we were looking for before we pick." But here you are with these grapes that are relatively unknown. You probably had to sort of source them in your originally somehow. We'll talk about that in a minute, but. Is this not a complete experiment all the time until we understand all the different factors that go into, creating a wine from these grapes?
Yep. I mean, we call it writing the book because, the French, the Spanish have had 1,000 years to work with Tempranillo or Cabernet or whatever it might be. And we've had, a dozen years.
Yeah.
So we're doing an awful lot of bench trials and A/B testing, both in terms of cultivation and in terms of winemaking. So it's hugely inefficient, and I'll just leave it at that. It's hugely inefficient. I mean, someone once asked me why I was doing this, and I couldn't really think of a reason. And then I realized that actually that was the reason, because it makes no economic sense to embark on this, because these things have no brand recognition. They have no fan base. You're having to convince people to buy a wine that they have no frigging idea what's in the bottle, and just to try something that they're unfamiliar with.
That this isn't. Yeah, I suppose that would be the driving, thought process and motivation to do this, right? It's something no one's ever seen. You're cutting edge, but this isn't, worldwide. This is happening in a lot of places. I happen to be of Armenian descent, and they've been making wine there for 6,000 years, but it all was stalled by the Soviets. And so they're kind of, I mean, they have grapes like Adani and Boscahat and Angoon, and no one's ever heard of those either, but the difference is they're Vitis vinifera, so they're sort of, I don't know, what's that, predisposed to making wine. How did you find these things that you stumbled? Were they wild in Missouri that you stumbled across them, or there was a farm that had them? There's a lot of them you have.
I mean, the initial finding kind of came from this guy Munson, and there were a bunch of there was a cohort of people around in New England, around New York, but the people I kind of stumbled into were mainly Missouri Germans, and they tended to have that Germanic kind of long view of things, like building cultures and things that would sort of extend beyond their lifetime, which is kind of, in one way, the tradition that I'm doing right now. So I discovered this book, and out of that, it was some years actually, I came across the fact that Munson had a nursery down in Denison, Texas, that had been lying fallow since 1910s, 20s. And some of these vines were still there. And the vineyard was on the grounds of what is now a Grayson County Community College.
Wow.
So but they had been untended. So you reason that if they were still alive after 80 years of neglect, they kind of felt like they had a right to exist in this world. So there was about, 10 or 12 years of donating to the college and asking them to, hey, could you have somebody send some cuttings? There's also a collector in Oregon who was kind of a fan of these grapes. There was Geneva in New York and UC Davis. They both have germ banks.
Wow.
And then there were occasionally random little vineyards. There was a vineyard, now it's now called Mount Pleasant in Augusta, Missouri, that was started by one Richard Munch, who was a brother of Friedrich Munch, who was a friend of Munson, and Munson bred a grape named Munch that he named after his buddy, and I got the vines from like one step removed from the source. And there are about a dozen of these that Munson bred to name after his Missouri buddies. There's one called Rommel, which is probably an ancestor to the desert fox, but never mind that.
There it is,
so they're just all over the place.
And it's the passion itself has to be partially just discovering these things and finding them, but then we go back to the myriad of complexities to making a palatable wine. Ones that, I don't know if you're trying to create like a world-class wine, you're trying to create an anecdotal wine, or are you trying to create, do we really want the worldwide wine consumer to recognize these things one day? Is that the objective, or it's just a...
You say passion. I mean, passion will only sustain for a while, and now it's kind of grim determination.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's kind of a quip, but I think one of the goals is to make $100 bottle of wine that people will feel proud to have bought. And we're not quite there, but we're getting there. We've gotten, I think we got 3 best of classes from San Francisco Chronicle. We've got there's a Julia Child award this last October that our wines were the wines served at that.
Really? Wow.
Well, the other quip is, I mean, the reason that the wines are good is that a hell of a lot of stuff has gone down the drain, because when you're doing something that is as open-ended an experiment as this, you can't will some of these grapes to make a good wine to save yourself. So you have to be not afraid to just pour the stuff down the drain.
Well, were you aware that when you find these grapes, let's talk about Rommel, you can talk about the Munch, were these grapes, when they were planted pre-Prohibition, used for wine, or were they table grapes, or?
No. So Munson, the guy that bred most of these, I mean, I'd say Munson bred, I don't know, 85% of the grapes that we have. So one of his goals was to make table grapes that market gardeners could have a grape that was ripening every week of the ripening season.
Wow.
And that's kind of a tour de force. So the wine grapes were sort of a sideshow to that. So in his book, he would say, oh, this makes a great wine, this makes a great table grape, et cetera. And I was kind of going from that. But, words that were written back in the 1890s, you have all this Victorian flowery language, and you have no idea what their tastes were,
right,
or what those grapes really were all about. So there's nothing you can do but try to find them, plant them, grow them, make a wine, and see what it is.
And so do we run across the same sort of patience required with a Vitis vinifera grape? And, they argue that your first leaf is worthless, your second leaf, you can't really do anything to your third or fourth leaf. And you have to learn this too about these grapes as to how they're maturing as far as the vine age and the resulting grapes, the yields. I mean, all these are brand new pieces of information that we've never dealt with. And then, I mean, you're trying to keep an eye on all those things. I mean, oh my gosh.
All those things. There's canopy treatment. There's sunlight exposure. Some of them really like it. Some of them really don't like it. There's even, we have a fairly hilly ground here that has a southern exposure, some has an eastern exposure. There's the soil at the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill, where you get sort of an accumulation of organic matter at the bottom. It tends to be lusher. And some of the varieties like it down there, and some of them like it at the top of the hill, and some like it at the eastern slope, some want the northern slope, where they'll come out later in the spring, some want the southern, where they'll come out earlier. So on top of everything else, we're trying to get like 2 blocks at least of each of these varieties, or we can test different things about where they are planted. I mean, if I were running the world, there would be 50 vineyards scattered around.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of your questions in your list was, what's the terroir of these grapes like? I have no friggin' idea. I mean, we've got a data point of 1. So
yeah, right. So
we don't know if it's the year, the grape, me, my personality, whatever. So we just can't draw a data point out in that regard.
There's a big event coming up. It's being touted by, I don't know, one of the other wine consumer clubs, but it was put on by a gentleman, Michael Juergens, who I think it's Burma. I think it's that Indian country next to India. And they're doing exactly that, except they're using Vitis vinifera, but they're growing, I think he chose 6 varietals and put them at 6 different elevations, and just to see what happens. And I guess their first harvest is coming up. This is a long project, but they're having trouble with monkeys. because they're protected animal and they can't build walls around the vineyard, so they're having trouble with monkeys taking the grapes.
They can't train them.
So I don't know, but I guess it's a problem you don't have in Missouri right now.
No, we have deer.
So yeah. So I'm gonna scroll through a couple of these grape varietals for the listeners because I want them to understand, what we're talking about, and then you can tell me just a couple of the high points or low points of that particular grape that you're trying to fix or understand better. Let's just and there's some really cool looking grapes here. So one of them that here is this Captivator with his giant giant berries, but a weird cluster shape. So what's with Captivator? What are you trying to do with that? What's it producing?
Well, frankly, that's that's one that I think we're going to let go.
Oh no, I'm sorry about Captivators.
Yeah. Well, the yield is too erratic, and the flavor is a little bit too meh, and it's also ripens very, very early. And there's a thing we have out here called the birdometer, which tells you when your grapes are ripe. But the way you tell is that the birds have eaten half of it, so it's very accurate but not prescriptive.
So that's just a complete departure from bricks and phenolic ripeness. We're going to go to the birdometer.
Yeah. So that fails the birdometer test. It's just
that's I guess if you're going to do it, you might as well use all the resources you have, and if it's when the birds are eating it, you might as well just do it.
Yeah, it's a tool. It's the tools we got. I mean, we could emulate the birds, but I don't know, for that one, it's just not interesting enough, frankly, to me. So.
Well, there's a few here. Without getting the ones that you're going to dump, which ones do you feel like you're going to continue to play with? Because there's some like the cluster of this one wine, and for the listeners, I'm at the TerraVox.wine website, Lenoir, which is a huge cluster. Is that an active grape that you're pursuing, Lenoir?
Yeah, I think it's Lenoir.
Lenoir, okay.
And this is actually a variety that predated Munson, and there's some controversy or some discussion about where it came from. There was around Anaheim, California. I've seen back 1840s, 50s.
Yes.
A bottle called Lenoir, like the black one.
Yes.
And that might be what the same grape, might not. However, that one. It makes one of the strongest red wines you'll ever have a chance to have. We found, though, this was there are Lenoir plantings and Herbamont, which is another one that predates Munson, that are planted in all around the world except for Antarctica. In fact, we have visited 140-year-old vineyards of this in France, down in the Cevennes, which is not a wine-growing region by reputation, but there are fans of these grapes over there that have been growing them for like over a century.
Well, that's interesting you said that about Anaheim, because Anaheim was a huge vineyard placements in that time when you're talking about the 1840s, 1850s, and it was completely eradicated by Pierce's disease.
Right.
And so if this is a grape that was growing there, it was rather prolific region for Southern California. As well as where I'm at right now in the San Gabriel Valley. But that's really interesting. It's a fascinating looking bunch.
Oh yeah, no, it's a wonderful producer. There's another variety called Favorite, which is a daughter of Lenoir, and that's actually a little bit cleaner. And we're planting a bunch of both of those.
Then there's this really dark skinned grape I see here called Lamanto.
Mm-hmm.
Is that active?
Yep. And that's actually one of the few. There's a nursery down in De Leon, Texas, that had some of that. So we're actually able to buy rooted vines. And that one, what to say about that? It tends to be very low bricks, but we can still make a wine out of it. And it's very dark, very prolific, big open clusters. We did have the idea of trying the reposado technique, where you harvest the grapes and you put them out in the sun, and then you come back a week later and you try to find your grapes through the cloud of fruit flies. So that didn't work.
Well, you are really working from the beginning here when you're doing this stuff. It is fascinating to hear about this. Are we creating, the wine? Let's go back the pre-prohibition and post-prohibition. Post-prohibition, the U.S. government went back to the South and tried to replant muscadine and varietals like that to continue the wine trade. When I was in Kentucky and tasted some Vitis Lambrusco wines, I actually thought they were kind of interesting enough to put in my club. And when I did finally get a hold of the winery afterwards, the guy says, I can't sell you that much. I need about, 400 or 500 cases of it. He goes, I can't sell you that much because they don't allow me to ferment that much here in Kentucky. As you can distill as much as you want, but you can't ferment so much. Are there any regulations in Missouri that get in the way of these tests and trying to create volumes of wine out of these grapes?
I've not heard of anything like that. I mean, there's certainly plenty of regulations that get in the way of everything, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, right. I know. Well, we do that all the time. And are these producing, and the reason I brought up muscadine is it produces, an off-dry wine, maybe even a sweet wine. But are these all creating what you would consider dry still wines? Are there some that lend themselves to a dessert, even like a 12% sugar wine kind of thing, or what? Don't even know. We're not even sure yet.
Yeah, there's two possible answers to that. There's one in particular called Wetumpka that we. I think we probably are going to drift towards having a little bit of RS in there just to give it, not make our sort of missionary complex is not to do let's make a sweet wine and get it out there, because it's all dry. But with that one, a little RS, I think, sort of balances the acidity.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there are a couple of those, Wetumpka being one, Norton being another, that they have enough acid where they really respond well to fortification. So Wetumpka will make a white port.
Wow.
That is really unusual. And if you have a changeover winemakers and you forget and leave a barrel in the back of the cellar for 5 years and don't tend to it, you'll end up with something that's really oxidized, and it tastes like single malt Scotch. It's the damnedest thing that you would not have expected that to come out of a wine glass.
Yeah, if you happen to forget, a 50-gallon barrel somewhere, like sounds like it really happened. And
allegedly, you want to be careful about admitting to too many mistakes on a podcast. Yeah.
I mean, I had a conversation with Mike Salacci from Opus early on in this show, and he talked about they did this extensive yeast garnering and testing from the wild yeast, what's out in the vineyard and what's in the forests that flank the vineyards, and they came up with this really interesting terms, the dog, the fox, and the something else. And I mean, all of those permutations of things that can happen. Are you using natural yeasts to do this? Are you inoculating? And if you're inoculating, what do you? I mean.
We did use natural yeasts once.
Oh,
no. There's Clark Smith, as maybe a name you're familiar with. He taught some of the classes we took at UC Davis, and he's been consulting with us. He's done a lot of work with doing actually genetic testing of yeasts in wineries, and found that the yeasts in the wines of reputable large wineries tends to be the yeast that's in that winery, because the yeast will go through several populations over the course of their fermentation.
Yeah.
So that's great for an established wine region. Out here, we do not have a century of winemaking with wine yeast. We have random stuff that's floating in the air, and as I said, we tried it. We had 3 different batches. One of them was fine, and the other were like, holy shit, no, ain't going to do that anymore.
Wow. Fascinating. And so what we end up with 12 to 15% alcohol? I mean, what kind of bricks or what kind of sugar content do most of these grapes have? And then are we getting like over the top 15 to 16% alcohol wines? Are we getting subdued wines at 12, 11%?
There are a couple where we've gotten up to 24, 28 bricks, but a lot of them are down at the 13, 14, 15. And so they tend to be low alcohol, tend to be Nice bit of acidity and a reasonable amount of tannins.
Is that a function of the fact that just for the listeners that we never really discussed where you're at? It looks like you're due east of Kansas City Airport, in the hills of the Platte County. And I read it on your website that you flew over looking for the proper soil. I'm not sure how you do that, but what were you looking for to decide that these were good places to plant these grapes?
Well, actually, it's due west of Kansas City Airport.
I'm sorry, due west. Yeah.
Yeah, and so these are the Los Hills. Los is a wind-deposited soil, and so in a prior life, when I first went to college, I studied agronomy.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked in the soil survey lab where we were actually doing the analyses of the soils of Missouri, particularly in this part of the world. So I actually knew what the soil profile was like by the geography. And I was looking for something that was fairly mineral rich, but not rich in organic matter, because you don't want a lot of vegetative mass. You want grapes, vines that will that are more balanced towards while not putting out a bunch of leaves and canes, but fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And even within that, each variety will have its own personality, and you can walk out in the vineyard and you can recognize different families of grapes. That these three varieties are sort of relatives of each other, and they have a fairly open canopy, and kind of reddish growing tips as they come out in the spring. These will have Kelly green leaves, and they're larger and they're scalloped and so forth. There's just a tremendous amount of variety within the each family.
I had this conversation, I think I told you briefly, with the French woman whose family was in Bordeaux during the war, et cetera. And she was talking about how poor the soil should be for grapes. In other words, how do we create such an amazing product and such an ethereal product out of what would normally be, uninhabitable soils and rocky and typical, Bordeaux style soils. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. And then here you are looking for a place to grow, non-vitis vinifera grapes and produce something of interest. I mean, the permutations of the variables become infinite to figure this out. Do we get deep roots, trying to find nutrients and create a terroir out of this soil?
We do, because the geological history is that the Missouri River, which we can see out of our window here in the gap in the trees, was the edge of the ice sheet last time around.
Wow.
So, the ice sheet is melting, the water's coming down, it's flowing, heading for the ocean. But as the ice sheet retreats, it has ground down to a powder, everything underneath it. So you have denuded soil, the wind picks it up. When it hits the river, there have been trees growing along the banks, and it tends to drop out. So we have deeper deposits, and it sorts the soil particles. Like most soils are a mixture of sand, clay, loam, and various degrees. Mm-hmm. These are all sorted by its same size particles that are all stacked up. The larger particles, the deeper deposits by the river, and then the particles get smaller and thinner as you go into the next county.
Wow.
So, so the hard part is getting the vines established, and you have to irrigate and water. But once back in 2012, I don't know if you recall the big drought that was hitting the Midwest. Mm-hmm. We did not have to turn on the irrigation system, because at that point, the roots had reached the water table. Because every year, as you know, you will prune off the tops, the cordons and the canes. And so basically the top starts over every year. But the roots will just keep on going until until they hit the mantle.
Wow, that part seems to be down the lines of regular wine production and trying to understand, where we're going to create. And so that leads to this question, which I already sort of asked, but I'm not sure there's an answer, but are we going to get terroir from these grapes? And we're not going to know this for a long. There's a comment made by, Michel Roland, and I've brought this up on the show before. We can grow wine here, and he's talking to a friend of mine in the wine business, but we're not going to know for 100 years what we're gonna be able to produce. I mean, that just seems daunting, and it seems like generations of winemakers trying to figure out what's happening.
Well, in order to talk about terroir, you got to have some kind of comparable. So we'll have to have, several vineyards around here doing the same grapes, so you can see what the common element is. Because, as I said, there's variation within each varietal on this hill or on that slope, and you don't know what one of the internal struggles, arguments, debates, whatever we have is when we describe these wines to people. Do we say, "Oh, this is kind of like this or that or the other thing that they might be familiar with"? But that's just kind of a misleading entry point. Because we're really trying to see what's different about these grapes. There's one grape called America, which interestingly is a name that we can't put on the label because TTB thinks we're misleading the public that we have grapes from America. I don't understand the logic, but there we are.
It's probably not part of their because they have that huge list of accepted grapes.
It's definitely not on the list. There's another variety called Albania, which we were able to get around printing the name backwards. But by the time we went for approval for the America label, they were on to us. So they said, no way. So, but anyway, even reading the literature back in the 1870s and 80s, they would say, man, this grape is really just tastes unusual. So it's, I don't know if you saw the Fargo movie where they described one of the criminals as funny looking and said, well, could you be more specific? Well, it's just generally funny looking.
Just funny looking.
So the grape is just unusual. I mean, it kind of tasted like meat.
That's a wonderful description. I've heard of cedar and, of course, leather and then black fruit, dark fruit, but meat, that's the new one.
Yeah, and the thing that people never say, they say, man, this tastes like grapes.
Yeah.
But, I don't know why.
Well, you know what? I agree with you on this. Again, going back to the Armenians and Georgian wines, I think it's a mistake to try and pigeonhole a new varietal or a new wine into some other character. It's kind of like Syrah of this, or kind of like Zinfandel. The Armenian grapes are indigenous. They have there's no reference to them. And so you start creating your own descriptors around it rather than comparing it. And I go back to the early days of winemaking in California. I'm talking about early, the 70s and 80s. When I used to work in my dad's shop, we loved to compare wines to their French counterparts. Oh, this is very Bordeaux-esque. This is very Burgundian. And we don't do that anymore. There's enough history and there's enough path and descriptors to say, this is, Rutherford, this is Oakville, this is Stag's Leap or Santa Maria. Like last night I had a Santa Maria Pinot Noir at a restaurant I'd never been to, a wine I'd never tasted. And I was, because of the history, able to say, yeah, this is very Santa Maria in character and, certainly expressive that way. So I think that's going to be a long haul for you. Do you have kids?
Nope.
Oh, man, we need a couple generations to figure this out.
Well, hopefully the thing will have a life after me, but...
Yeah, well, that's what it's about. I mean, really, the idea of wine is sort of history in a bottle, right? And so there's a lot of history being produced here right now. So, I see the website is very active. I see you have a lot of events there. We've talked a little bit about production. We've talked a little bit about the vineyard side of this, and then once you get to the winery making the wines. But man, wine is, unfortunately, and I have this romantic version of wine that marketing and profitability, if it was removed from the equation, would be a different animal. But I see you do lots of events here at the winery. You have tastings, you have pairings. Are they popular?
Yeah, not as it's always a struggle to get people to come up, and because it's a destination thing. It's not like people are walking by and can drop in.
That's true, right.
But what we have found is that in order for people to understand what we're doing, they almost have to come up here and see the place and to understand what we're doing. It's really hard to get somebody to want to buy a bunch of stuff by clicking on the internet.
Is it how far from the Kansas City airport is it?
We can see the control tower from our front porch.
Oh, so it's close.
Yeah.
But it is up in the hills, it's a little bit of a trek. Sorry, like you said, destination.
Well, it's because of those wind deposited hills along the Missouri River. It was a relatively undeveloped property because I guess it's harder to put in, sewers and infrastructure and all that. So we're 20 minutes from downtown Kansas City. It's about as close as you can. It's surprisingly close to a large urban area for being as rural as it appears to be. We were careful to get a little perimeter here, so when you look around, you don't see any other structures around here, but that's because we kind of control our view shed.
And that was strictly because you did your soil analysis and your flybys, and you said, obviously, I mean, maybe it's not so obvious. So maybe some people pick a winery location because of the location, just because it'll be easy to get to, versus, we think it's a good place to grow wine, but that's the reason you're there. And now you're going to create the destination is there a kitchen there or a restaurant there?
Well, there's a food service. There's a catering kitchen there. It's, so the site selection was first based on soil. And then my wife, who works at the art gallery in town at the time, she had to do a test drive to make sure that was within her limit of commutability. And it turns out that we are 350 feet inside that boundary.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
And that was smart. I wish I could be as smart as that with some of the things I've done that my wife decided were it's advantageous.
Well, there are other things that we're not going to discuss.
Yeah. So, the rest of the wine world deals with all kinds of marketing headwinds and issues. And I've had canned wine manufacturers on the show and bag and box and all kinds of issues that surround our industry. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, are we even there yet that we have to wrestle with what would have been the regular headwinds trying to market a brand? Or is this so new that we really, I'm not even sure about those issues yet? Marketability, biodynamic. I'll be more specific. Organic farming, orange wines, all the contemporary issues that wineries are dealing with, trying to keep up. Are we dealing with those things yet?
That's a complex set of issues there. I mean, first of all, brand recognition. There's negative brand recognition. But what ironically, some of the headwinds we run into it's called, people talk about natural wines without any understanding of what the hell that is. I mean, in terms of natural yeast, like friggin' get it. It's
ain't gonna happen.
And I challenge anyone who's sticking wine in the bottle to tell me what that yeast is going to be 6 months from now, because it'll be something else.
That's a good point.
So it's the I don't know, we call it the cuisine of righteousness. It's like
great term.
Some idea in someone's head that is just preventing them from seeing what's in front of them.
Yeah. Well, the word natural, there is no such term in the the federal FDA for, not even for food, actually. So, I take exception to that term anyway. And I suppose ultimately it lands on, something that's been less played with, right? You're not adding defoaming agents necessarily. You're not adding the one of 76 things you can add in California to a wine to stabilize or do what you want to do. And it's pretty obvious after all the years I've been doing this and tasting wines, when you see wines that have been touched like that. It's just clear that the wines have been played with, and it's even clearer as the older they get that the wines were played with, because they start to fall apart faster and they separate faster, the flavor profile. Are we there yet? Do we know what these wines can do age-wise? Is there enough acid? Do we have balance? I mean...
They have balance. They have structure. I think we, as I said, we are searching for typicity, like what each of these grapes wants to be.
Yeah.
And we're closer in some than others. Norton is probably the grape that is probably the most widely known, before we came along. And for that one, we're doing a rosé that's done traditionally, by reduction, another that's done by oxidation, and then making a wine from the result, the resulting must. which is strong enough where you can stick a fork in it and it'll stand up. But we discovered that making a port out of that is, and it's, I think, one of the best ports that I've ever had, frankly. And that's apart from any biases, it doesn't have that sort of raisiny, cloyy thing you often get with ports. It's just a delicious thing to drink.
Well, I'm looking at the picture for the again, for the listeners. I'm at TerraVox.wine, and he's got a dozen or so grapes here. And this Norton has a wonderful cluster, but they're large berries, and not consistent size in that bunch. But that's an interesting point. If you're making port style wines, and for the listeners, that's taking a grape, crushing it, fermenting it, then arresting the fermentation with distilled brandy, or usually grape brandy, or grape distillate to arrest the fermentation, thus resulting in some higher sugar content and higher alcohol content. And that could be where some of these things land, right? I mean, that's what you just figure out that they're good for. But you also had a wine in here on your list, which is made from the Saunier method. And for the listeners, again, this is siphoning off the first, what's the term you'd use? The top part of the first pressing of the rosé, but
yeah, the free run kind of minimal exposure to the skins, because I know most people realize in grapes, most of the color is in the skins. The pulp tends to be white. There are some exceptions to that, but so if you leave it exposed for a few hours, you'll get a little bit of that red or pink color in the resulting wine.
And how are the rosés coming from these interesting varietals?
Well, for the Norton, it's a wonderfully structured wine when we do it by the oxidized process. Otherwise, if you do it by the traditional method, it has the floral notes are there. There are a couple of the grapes that are just lightly colored, and all they will make is a rosé, even though we're fermenting them as though they were a red wine. I guess you'd call it an orange wine, except it's redder than that.
So, well, there's an Armenian wine, Armas, and she's a wonderful family that it makes a lot of wines, and her rosé is virtually a light red. I mean, really, it's hard to call it a rosé, but rosé comes by many flavors. And if you think about the Provence, which is drier and more sophisticated, and then we had white Zinfandel in the 70s, and that's changed, the perception of Americans throughout the world, this American white rosés throughout the world. So here you have a chance to create your own version of this, or your own interpretation of what that might be with these grapes. I noticed that virtually all of the locations to get these wines, Gomer's Midtown and Willow Springs Mercantile and Noah's Cupboard, they're all in Missouri. They all seem to be local. How has that been? Let's go back. There's always a propensity on the consumer side to try and drink local, right? If you go to Lodi, you're going to probably see a lot of Lodi on the thing. If you go to Bordeaux, you see a lot of Bordeaux. I mean, it's just the way it is, and it should be. But how has the local community responded to these ideas?
It's hard to say. I mean, the people we see at the winery are coming in because they heard the story. They heard there's something up here. There's something interesting going on. Anytime, it's hard to service a wholesale, effort.
Yes.
Beyond because if you do the math, we made 37 different wines last year.
That's a lot.
So that means we don't have like a lot of pallets of any given one.
Right.
So to support a supply chain is kind of not in the cards.
No.
And frankly, the inefficiencies of doing all the work you're doing to make a batch of wine that is, 20 gallons, means that even if you're selling at wholesale discounts, it's not profitable to do that.
Yeah, wholesale is a whole different world.
Yeah.
But that's what I thought was interesting here, because you have a substantial amount of locations, so it's almost as though there is this wholesale, even in Whole Foods, which is incredible. Not that just for the listeners in LA, to get your wine into Whole Foods is an act of God to do that, because it's very difficult to do. So it's not like you don't have any wholesale presence, because this is a substantial amount of locations to put inventory in. So that's.
Yeah, but there's only, I don't know, a half a dozen of the varietals that there's enough production to support those wholesale chains, because there's all that other stuff that is pretty much for sale at the winery only or online.
How did the Smithsonian Magazine find out about you?
I think I had done a brief thing for Atlas Obscura. Someone found out about us, and so that writer actually pitched it to the Smithsonian, and they said yes. And ironically, we've actually, this was completely unassociated with that. We had done a couple of presentations at the Smithsonian a while back, just about the cultural history of the grapes, and it as a just through part of their the Smithsonian Associates has this sort of a lecture program. So we've been there, but there was no connection between that and this magazine article.
That could be, I'm a marketeer by trade, and that could be, the impetus for all of this, not just this one article, but since it's American, and so the Smithsonian has heard about it, and since it's new, and since it's an industry of great history throughout the world, that could be the angle. That could be the whole story that comes to the table for people to, once you settle on what these things can do and start producing quantities that are available to the rest of the country. Because there's a movie going around the country called Cup of Salvation. It's a sort of a docudrama, a very close friend of mine in Armenia named Vahe Kushgarian. But the story isn't about his winery in Armenia, which he's a brilliant winemaker, but it's about him going to Iran and virtually stealing grapes from a vineyard that hadn't been used for 100 years and making a wine from it. And the whole story about getting it out of Iran and wearing a flak jacket to get it and all this stuff. And so that has created a fervor about his other wines that he makes in Armenia. And he makes very good wines there, particularly a sparkling. But the story that's getting him popularity is making this obscure wine from this obscure vineyard in a place that's had been forbidden. And so I'm thinking, wow, this could be TerraVox's, moment here, where we are producing American wines from American grapes and figuring it out. It's going to take a little time to figure it out, but actually do something sort of historical here.
Yeah, well, I hope I don't have to smuggle grapes out of Iran to get attention, but
maybe Utah.
Although you touch on something, and I don't know if you're aware that there's a film, a French winemaker was out here, heard about what we were doing, and he made a film called Vitis Prohibita, which is from the European perspective. A lot of these Native American direct producers were quite popular in Europe way back when, before the DOC regulations came in, and before in the 1930s and going into the 1940s in Austria and Germany, there was a movement that I think was called borderism, which was like, let's get rid of all this foreign stuff. So they started passing legislation forbidding the making of commercial wines from these American cultivars.
Wow.
Now that that whole movement sort of morphed into Nazism, and when the Venn diagram that overlaps Hitler and winemaking is not a large one.
No.
But these laws are still on the books. And there are producers over there that are beginning to question whether they need to maybe loosen up and be able to work with some of these grapes, just in terms of productivity, disease resistance, the fact that climate change is an issue for some of the folks over there. We don't have that in Missouri because it's illegal, but still, they are, others are concerned.
That's a really interesting point. Hell, for the listeners, there's been a huge exchange over the years in the 1800s between rootstock and the varietals. The French they're growing their own wines, but they came via America at some point because they lost all their vineyards. And here, and then certainly during the war, Hitler, I think they found 80,000 bottles in his cellar he didn't even drink. So it was a prize of of the Nazis invading France, and that was one of their takes, right? That was like the spoil of war. But they're having problems. I mean, Bordeaux has just authorized, I think, 5 or 6 grapes to grow, like Touriga Nacional, that you could put into a regular Bordeaux blend. I think that's been approved to a certain extent, and it has a lot to do with disease resistance and climate change and ability to ripen. And Burgundy's being affected greatly by this. That's an interesting thought. And wow, if you had more worldwide winemakers playing with these grapes, the learning curve would be a lot shorter to produce interesting things.
Right. Right. But even now, one of the characteristics of Labrusca vines is that they have this little sort of reddish growing tip when they're coming out in the spring, and then when the barometer falls and there's a storm coming in, the leaves will tend to turn over and show their silvery undersides, and it'll ripple up winds. So you can drive around Italy and France and you'll see acres of this stuff. It's sort of off the books, but it's like, hey, wait a minute.
That's so interesting.
That's not vinifera.
That's so interesting. And we're already at 53 minutes, but I did want to ask you, since you brought it up, and is there an what's the word? I always stumble over this. Amplifography, the grape leaves, this difference amongst these this species of grapes. I mean, it's a whole study of Vitis vinifera, but I suppose it would be the same.
The Munson book is called The Foundations of American Viticulture, and he went into great length about the different characteristics of each of these, we'll call them bloodlines, that he was using to breed his grape cultivars. So
fascinating. Well, Mr. Hazarath, he brought Zinfandel supposedly to the Napa Valley, and then he went off to maybe it was Brazil. And anyways, they never found him. They sent somebody to go find him, and then they never found that person either. So we don't know what happened to him, but he was supposedly...
I thought he was eaten by a crocodile or something.
Right? So I don't know. Hopefully we're going to stay away from some of those plights when it comes to doing this thing. This has been a fascinating conversation. We have much to talk about. I hope we can do it again.
Well, try the wines. And thanks for doing this.
If I'm anywhere near Kansas City, for sure, we're coming out and having a tasting session.
Well,
can you ship
here, and there will be wine. There will be a lot of it, and a lot of different stuff, and too much of it, perhaps.
Can you ship to California?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna bring in a couple of these things and have this little tasting at my home, and see what people think.
Okay, give us a report. We do appreciate feedback, because as I said, we're trying to find out where these grapes want to go, and that depends on people trying them and giving us their thoughts.
Appreciate the time again, Jerry. Thank you so much, and good luck, and congratulations all at the same time.
Thank you, Paul.
Cheers.
See you around.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Carrion. Don't forget to subscribe, because there's more great interviews on their way. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.